Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation here on the Tattooed Historians YouTube and Facebook. I'm so happy to be back online. This is two nights in a row for me, so this is getting really interesting. I'm almost pulling an all-nighter, but I'm having a great time, and I'm really going to have a great time speaking with my good friend Tim Cook. And I want to give his bio first before I get Tim talking with me on here, because everyone needs to know Tim, and he's been on here before, but some of you are new, and I want to make sure you know his background. Tim Cook is the chief historian and director of research at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, Ontario. One of my favorite museums, everybody. You need to go see this. His best-selling books have won multiple awards, including 4 Ottawa Book Awards for literary nonfiction and 2 C.P. Stacy Awards for the best book in Canadian military history. In 2008, he won the WW2 Book Prize for At the Sharp End, and again in 2018 for Vimy, The Battle and the Legend. Shock Troops won the 2009 Charles Taylor Prize for literary nonfiction. And Tim is a frequent commentator in the media and a member of the Royal Society of Canada and the Order of Canada. Tonight, we're going to chat about Tim's latest book, The Good Allies: How Canada and the United States Fought Together to Defeat Fascism during the Second World War. A link to order the book is in the description below. And I want to thank Penguin Random House Canada for sending me not only a reader's copy, but a hardback copy from my permanent collection. They know I love that index in the back. Tim, how are you?
Good, John. Great to be back with you.
Yeah, it's great to be reunited again. It's been a while. It's been too long since we last spoke. And but in the meantime, you've come out with another book, so it's good timing.
It's good timing. Yeah, and the book, book on Canada, United States in the Second World War, or World War II for your American audience, of course. It's timely. I hope. When I started writing it about 2 years ago, I was thinking it'd be a good book to come out in September of 2024. I was aware the election was happening, the heated contest, of course. A lot of firepower back and forth, and I wanted my friends in the United States to have a good sense of that Canada was an important ally during the Second World War, during World War II, in hemispheric defense, in wartime industry, in security, and so much more. So, anyways, great to have the book out.
Yeah, and it was a fantastic read as always, Tim, and I really think you write for the people, and that's what I really appreciate about your work. It's for everybody to read and comprehend and ponder the thesis and your argument going through each one, and it's just fascinating to think about this relationship between these two nations, because many times we're just looking at the relationship of the U.S. to what's happening overseas, or Canada to what's happening overseas, and we're not looking north to south. And I think that's a really interesting thing that you've brought to life here.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, you're right. I mean, there are hundreds of books written on Canada in the Second World War. I've written a number of them, not hundreds, but a number of them. And I realized that, most of them pay attention, as you say, to that relationship to Britain, of course, because Canada is a dominion in the British Commonwealth at this point, but we're really tied to Britain, and our military is tied to Britain, and we come into this war, and we can talk maybe a bit more about that at Britain's side. But I realized that we really don't have a great sort of one-volume history of looking at Canada, the United States, and that too is an absolutely crucial relationship. And one of the arguments I make in the book is we can't focus on our expeditionary forces, our navies fighting around the world, our various squadrons, our destroyers, our corvettes. We can't focus on the army in Hong Kong or at Dieppe, or fighting in Sicily or mainland Italy or Northwest Europe. We can't focus on the RCAF unless first, of course, North America is secure. And that's almost always a given, that somehow Canada and the United States figure out how they're going to defend North America when frankly, one country is at war, that'd be Canada, for almost 2 years in advance of the United States. It's a complicated mechanism, and it's the key piece, I would suggest, before we can then fight abroad against those fascist forces, that war of utter necessity that has to be won.
The one person who I really thought differently about in your book than ever before is the Prime Minister of Canada.
Right.
Because we're obviously, or we many times think of FDR and Churchill, and which we just had a live stream about that. And we think of some other major leaders in the Allied forces. And sometimes the Prime Minister of Canada is forgotten about for various reasons. And I would love for you to discuss him here, because I think sometimes he gets a bad rap from certain people. This kind of brings him in a different light. And I'd love for you to speak about him.
Yeah, William Lyon Mackenzie King is Canada's longest serving prime minister. He's our prime minister during the Second World War. And you're right, John. For a long time in Canadian history, he was seen as a bit of a clown, a bit of a joke. He was not terribly charismatic. He was a waffler. He was one of those leaders who took the pulse check of everyone multiple times. He doesn't fare well in comparison to Roosevelt or Churchill, these two giants of the war, giants of history. Throw in de Gaulle, who everyone hated, but nonetheless had a presence. Think of the Axis leaders, Hitler, of course, Mussolini, and others. So he gets squeezed out in a way that Canada gets squeezed out a bit in the war, too. And yet Mackenzie King plays a really important role in bringing Canada into the war. And then when he is shocked, as he is in September of 1939, when he guides Canada to declare war in the House of Commons, and the Americans and Roosevelt stay neutral. And he feels that it's a great betrayal, because Roosevelt was a great admirer of Roosevelt. And he saw the United States as a great Western democracy. And how could it not fight on the side of Britain and France? Well, there's lots of reasons for that. And I spent some wonderful time in the Roosevelt archives, and saw amazing public opinion polls where in September of 39, only 2.5% of Americans want to go to war. That's not 25%, that's 2.5%. So clearly Roosevelt understood his countrymen and countrywomen. And yet Mackenzie King, or King as I call him, spends an important part of the first year and a half working with the White House, becoming friendly with Roosevelt, getting good deals for Canada. And I argue that Mackenzie King, who you may remember, I just said he's a bit of a clown in Canadian history, or a joker, partially because he left behind this amazing diary, a diary he kept his whole life. It's about 30,000 pages, if you can believe that. He kept it for over 50 years. It's an astonishing document. He recorded every single night what had happened to him during the day, the people he met, the people he worked with, the people he felt had slighted him. He was a deeply lonely man. He never married. He had no kids. And so he pours out all of this bile and sadness into this diary, as well as the fact that he was a spiritualist. So he engaged in seances and table rapping, and he looked for signs on the clock face. And when this was revealed after his death in 1950, people said, oh my gosh, this boring old man, our longest serving prime minister, he was actually really interesting, but he was interesting in a weird way because he talked to his dead mom and his dead dog and all these things. And I hope that I, along with other historians more recently, have brought back a little bit of Mackenzie King as this shrewd and sharp political operator. You don't stay prime minister for 22 years without knowing how to work the levers of power, and he did. And so I write about that. But he comes off well when we look at the relationship north-south over the 49th parallel. He has a harder time dealing with Churchill, who didn't like him. thought he was meek and mild and too wishy-washy. But Mackenzie King does good things for Canada in his relationship with Roosevelt and the White House.
Mhm. I think a lot of my friends back home in the United States forget about Newfoundland not being part of Canada at this time. It's its own dominion. And that plays a part in your book, a major part in your book as well, because how does Newfoundland fit into this equation of defense of mainland Canada, if you will, and or at least the eastern side of the shore of Canada, and the idea of this kind of back and forth with America as far as are there going to be bases here or is this going to be something else? Could you tell us a little bit about that, Tim, where how Newfoundland fits into this picture as far as this kind of little enclave that's sitting there and how's it going to be used, et cetera?
Yeah, yeah. The Rock, as often is called then and now, a separate dominion from Canada, proud to be a part of the British Empire, had contributed mightily in the First World War, but suffered horrendous casualties. But during the Second World War, it will play a key role as an outpost for the Battle of the Atlantic. And what's interesting about it, in this story at least, is that both Canada and the United States garrison troops there, thousands of troops, airmen, naval, air force, and the Rock becomes critical in the defense of the sea lanes and in keeping Britain in the war. And it's an interesting geographical area, of course. It's a huge island. And Canada really has to figure out how it will negotiate with the United States over Newfoundland, how it will work with Newfoundland, a separate dominion, how it will work with London as well, with the British. And so it's an area of contested diplomacy, but the Canadians rush in their armed forces to garrison it because, it simply is critical to the Battle of the Atlantic. And when the U-boats cross the Atlantic and when they begin to sink ships in great numbers off the East Coast, and then when the United States is drawn into the war with the attack on Pearl Harbor and throughout the Pacific, it really is that linchpin in guiding those merchant ships across, and allows for air power and things like that. But maybe just to come back to your earlier point, some of your American friends who may not remember Newfoundland as a separate dominion, there's a lot of Canadians who don't know that either, because Newfoundland joins after the war, after this friendly invasion, and the wealth that these soldiers from both Canada, United States, and Britain bring, and it becomes a part of Canada there. And it's just one of many stories that I talk about in the book. In terms of, I guess we've been talking about North American defense or hemispheric defense and how that works, and fascinating stuff with Canada, working with the United States, with Ottawa and Washington, trying to just figure out how are you going to work together to defend North America. And the Canadians benefit a lot from a friendly White House that wants a strong Canada on its northern frontier. That's critical, because the doomsday scenario is that Britain will fall in June of 1940 or the summer of 1940 after the disastrous collapse of France and the evacuation of Dunkirk, and that Canada could be invaded at some point, and that's a doomsday scenario. So this is really, it's important to Canada, but it's also important to the United States.
Mm-hmm. There's an issue of trust as well, because of the fact that I think some Canadians at this time still remember the War of 1812, right. and they're like, they're not knowing if the Americans show up, if they're going to leave, apparently. Yeah. Or they're going to settle in. What that was a point that really shocked me, was that was still a lingering issue of this creep of Americanism, if you will, into Canadian society, and they're not going to want to go back home, basically.
Yeah. This is a fear of Mackenzie King and the government, but also many Canadians, because we're still proud part of the British Commonwealth, or, technically the Commonwealth, but really still called the British Empire. There's French Canada, which is about a quarter of the country at that point, which has fewer ties. And yet much of Canadian history with the United States is of war and conflict. The American Revolution, think of the invasion in 1775. There's all kinds of conflict in the 1780s and 90s. The War of 1812 you mentioned, of course. The 1830s and 40s, when there's rebellion in Canada, Americans cross the border. The Civil War is a fraught period, and there's tremendous worry. Some of it self-inflicted in Canada by allowing Confederate agents and soldiers in Canada to raid into the U.S. We're not good neighbors, and the Americans are not good neighbors back to Canada. And things really, it takes until the early 20th century to begin to sort things out through minor treaties and increasing trade. Intermarriage is important. Immigration is important. All of that. But it's the Second World War that is that changing moment. And in the book, I have some interesting surveys. And surveys were done for the first time in Canada in the early part of the war. And so we have a bit of a better sense of what Canadians thought. And they very much see the United States and Americans as crucial to the war effort. And so if Canada's going to support Britain to the hilt, as we do, and when France falls and Britain retreats back to the island, we send a second division there. There's already a Canadian division there. We send some of our best modern destroyers. We send our best squadrons. But we largely denude Canada of its defenses. And that really worries the Americans, who have some plans, as you've alluded to a bit there, of, okay, well, if maybe we can station thousands of American soldiers to help you defend your coasts. And Mackenzie King and the government says, no, we can't do that. That's infringing too much on our sovereignty. So we need to figure out how we're going to convince the Americans that we are not a liability. And they do that. They build up the defenses. And certainly when both Canada and the United States find themselves allied in the war from December of 41, so a lot of those mechanisms are in place, including the Permanent Joint Board on Defense to help deal with security issues, issues of opening up the North. The Alaska Highway is a really neat story, and the defense of the West Coast as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of that movie Greyhound, and I love that movie for a number of reasons, but also because you're getting to see other people who are running the convoys. It's not an American movie per se. There are Canadians involved, there are British involved, etc. You brought up the number of how many percentage of these overseas journeys were led by Canadian ships and such. And I thought that was astounding because, again, coming from America, we're thinking that we really took the lead on getting things across the Atlantic when we got involved, along with maybe the British, and the Canadians are sometimes forgotten about. What's that transatlantic journey and getting things across that ocean to Churchill and England like for the Canadians working alongside the Americans in those smaller numbers?
You're right, John. I think Canada does get forgotten, and we could talk a little bit about that later, because one of my previous books, The Fight for History, I said that Canada hadn't done a very good job in telling its history, and we shouldn't expect others, the British, the French, the Americans, or others, to tell the Canadian story. That's up to us. And we can come back to that. But you're exactly right. The Royal Canadian Navy is a really important supporter of those convoys. And of course, we're in the war from September of 39. So we're learning. We're working with the Royal Navy. And by the end of the war, about 50% of the convoys are being taken across, shepherded across by the Royal Navy, 48% by the Royal Canadian Navy, and only 2% by the United States Navy. Now, that's in about the Atlantic, and we need to acknowledge, of course, that most of the U.S. Navy is in the Pacific fighting their two-front war. Where the United States is invaluable, of course, is in the wartime production of weapons, of tanks, of aircraft, of machine guns and shells and everything. And again, this is a really interesting story because since my book has come out, I've talked to friends in the United States, scholars of World War II, who said, I had no idea that Canada was so deeply involved in wartime production. And we were a great supplier of weapons, 16,000 aircraft we create here from a base of zero almost, millions of shells, hundreds of millions of shells. In fact, perhaps our greatest contribution, which surprised me, this is my 19th book, edited and written, 850,000 trucks. And I knew that, but I didn't know that the Russians were using them, and I knew the British and the Americans. And this interesting stat I found that in late 1942 in the Desert War, so Montgomery's 8th Army, about half of his trucks are Canadian made. So it's a really significant contribution, and one we never think of. And we never think of the mineral contributions from Canada. It's a big country. We are digging out 3 billion pounds of nickel and about that much aluminum, much of which goes to the United States for wartime production. And so the wartime economies of Canada and the United States are almost seamlessly connected in the early part of the war. And they piggyback on the auto industry, and they really develop this. And I argue in the book that this is a significant part of the Canadian contribution. And it's why the United States both wants a strong Canada, but benefits from a strong Canada. And it goes back to the idea of alliance making. And again, if you look at almost any American history on the wartime alliances, they're all about with Britain, and then dealing with the Free French and that thorny issue. And what do you do with China, of course, and Canada just gets ignored. And I don't want to sound like a broken record or a whiny historian type. Oh, more on Canada. Canada didn't win the war on its own. Okay, let's just establish that. But it does play a pretty significant role, including 1.1 million Canadians in uniform. And this is from a country of 11.5 million, and about 2 million Canadians directly working in wartime industry. So it is a country at war, society geared for this total war. But as I argue in the book, it couldn't have done it without the support of the United States.
That border is also relatively porous in a way, as far as people traveling across for various reasons, not only families and friends, but also commerce and men and probably some women who want to join up in the war effort in uniform.
Yeah.
You've found numbers on that as well, Tim, where some Americans that even though it was 2.5% said that we want to go to war and save, some of those 2.5% apparently crossed the border and wanted to be a part of the action. Can you speak on that for a little bit, because that number to me is quite high. Like I believe it, but it's higher than I thought.
It's really high. It's around 30,000 now.
Yeah,
that was tabulated. And of course, many of the Americans who came across the border, they lied about their residency and citizenship. Of course, the Neutrality Acts made it illegal for Americans to enlist in the Canadian Armed Forces or others. Now, American authorities largely turned a blind eye to that. And some interesting stories in the book of Canadian pseudo agencies, the RCAF, recruiting in New York for pilots because they really needed experienced pilots, because one of Canada's major contributions is the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which eventually trains up 131,000 airmen, British, New Zealand, Australian, Canadian, but also thousands of Americans. And of those 30,000 Americans, about 9,000 or so serve in the RCAF, many of them remaining in Canada as part of the training. But a lot of those young guys had enlisted because they wanted to get in the fight. They wanted to be in the battle against the fascists and against occupied Europe. And they went overseas. And just this summer, John, I was in Iceland and Norway on a trip. And I always visit the cemeteries when I have a chance to go to a country where I know there are Commonwealth war graves. And I went to Iceland. Of course, Iceland is occupied by both Canadians and Americans during the course of the war because it's a key geographic feature. And I went to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and I saw air crews there, British, Canadian, and others. And I have been to other sites and seen Americans who have gone down. And so these crews are multinational for the bombers, and of course many Americans served with infantry units as well. Windsor and Detroit is an easy crossing point, and so we know there are a number of Americans killed in the Dieppe raid of August 1942, for example. So these are really interesting stories that I tell in the book, and one of the ways I draw it out is this, again, I think it was last year, I was at Arlington National Cemetery, and there's a cross of sacrifice there. And it was erected in 1927, and Canadians went down there, and it was to honor those Americans who served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War, of which about 38,000 we know of, and possibly as high as 57,000. If it was 57,000 in the First War, that's about 1 in 10 Canadians was American. In the Second World War, and the Cross of Sacrifice is also serves for the Second World War and the Korean War, and it's a powerful monument there, I think, to remind us that it's not just service, it's sacrifice that binds the two countries together. That blood was paid in this war of absolute necessity against the Nazis and the fascists.
You alluded to your previous book earlier, the Fight for History, and it really does fit well into this one, because as I was going through the Good Allies, I was wondering how I'd never heard of a lot of this. It's just not there. There's not, Hollywood doesn't produce the films. Luckily, Canada does have a great production of documentaries now, which hopefully will be going to a wider audience. But in the Fight for History, you talked about how historical memory is always fluid, obviously, and we're constantly wondering, what is our history and how does it appeal to this generation or that generation? Why do you think, Tim, that for someone like me who studied history for years and years, I didn't know half of what was in the Good Allies about the Canadian story? Why do you think that is in general?
Yeah. I wouldn't blame yourself, and you're certainly among the most educated of North Americans, I'll call you. For many years, we didn't do a good job in this country in telling this important history. We didn't build monuments. There's still no separate Second World War monument overseas or in Ottawa. We have the Juno Beach Center, erected in 2003, but it's a museum, really, even though it's become a space and a focal point, I think, for pilgrimages and for gatherings and for understanding the Canadian actions on Juno Beach. We didn't do the same films or documentaries, and all of that's taken time, and I think that took a toll on our historical understanding. And so we need to do a better job at this. You need to keep working at it, and history and historical understanding takes energy, right? And apathy may be the greatest enemy of this type of understanding. And now, as we are down to our final veterans, probably we're under 10,000 in Canada of Second World War veterans, all 98 years of age or older. And you told me you were doing a tour this summer of the Normandy region, and I was there too for our 80th anniversary. I got to meet a dozen of the veterans there. They were between the ages, I think, of 98 and 104. And just incredible to talk to these eyewitnesses to history. And one of the great things about working at the Canadian War Museum is I've spent the last 22 years speaking to veterans. And it's given me a different appreciation and maybe a different sense of obligation to tell these stories, to tell them right. And my books, John, I'm not just into heroic history and, stand behind the flag history. I tell the good and the bad. Canada made all kinds of mistakes during the Second World War. Every country made terrible errors, attacks on civil liberties driven by fear or racism or what have you. I try to explain that in the book. In a particular case, the forced relocation of Japanese Canadians, which was directly tied to the forced relocation and imprisonment of Japanese Americans, a dark stain in both countries' histories. But I also try to explain how these things happened. It's not useful to stand in the present day and lob grenades 80 years into the past, right? We need to understand what people were thinking at the time, what motivated them. Could they have acted differently? And I think this book helps to shed some light on that part, but on so many other aspects, including the sovereignty issue that you alluded to earlier, and the North, which is a really interesting part of Canada, but was largely uninhabited except for really Indigenous people at the time. And the United States wanted to build a road to connect the states to Alaska. And Canada agrees to that, and the Alaska Highway is built. Just an incredible feat of engineering, still there today, one of the many legacies from the war still there. And but Ottawa's afraid. 30,000 Americans, workers and army were in the North, and they really got afraid when the Americans, in a jokey way, started answering the phone saying "Army of Occupation." That didn't go over too well in Ottawa. So there's a struggle and the tension during the course of the war to be a good ally, but not to lose who we are. Our Canadian identity and our, Canadian sovereignty. And we have to work hard at this. We send some of our best soldiers and diplomats to Washington. Lester B. Pearson, future Prime Minister of Canada, is our late war ambassador there. Lieutenant General Maurice Pope, one of our best generals, we send there. And we are trying to continue to have a voice, which becomes more difficult when the British really lean into that special alliance there. But we are most effective when we are defending North America with the United States. And that's our unique proposition, I suppose, to this security pact, as well as the wartime industry. And all of that allows us then to send the hundreds of thousands of sailors and airmen and infantry and troopers and others overseas, of which Canada, again, plays a pretty important role. And if I could just mention 3 amphibious landings, or maybe 4 actually, that are important. In North Africa, no Canadian soldiers landed, but we sent 17 corvettes. And those were corvettes that were crucial and needed in the Battle of the Atlantic. But we peeled them off to assist the torch landings in late 1942. So again, we're reducing our own security to help the Allied cause. If we think of the Sicily landings in July of 1943, think of 3 American divisions on the left, 3 British on the right, 1 Canadian in the middle, which actually plays a really important role. We're there for the invasion of mainland Italy, right? The Americans on the left coast, the British and the Canadians on the right. And then I suppose the day of day, the invasion of invasions, the 6th of June, 1944, 2 British divisions, 2 American with a 3rd in reserve, and 3rd Canadian division landing on Juno. That gives you a sense just there, perhaps, of the important role that Canada played in this part of the war effort. Now, it doesn't include the Pacific, of which Canada plays a very little role, except to help defend Alaska and the Kiska campaign and a few other things. But Canada certainly punched far above its weight. And I think Canada understood that it had to pull its weight during the course of the war. And I think there are probably lessons here for Canada in 2024 with all kinds of discussions in this this world at war, a very dangerous place that Canadians realize, I think increasingly so, we need to have a stronger military. We need to show our allies, which goes beyond the United States, although that's a crucial element, that we can engage in important operations. And maybe there's also a lesson about North America. I mean, again, the Arctic is becoming a very hot battleground, it looks like. And Canada needs to figure out how it can contribute to that hemispheric defense. And these are just some of the lessons I think I found in the book as I was researching this. And, John, to be fair, encountering stories that I hadn't known before, despite doing this for 30 years and 19 books and a dozen national exhibitions. There's a lot that's new here, but the way history is interesting, why you read it, why I read it, why hopefully people are interested in it, there are lessons to this day. It echoes forward. The dark shadow continues, I think, to shade the way in which we think in this contemporary world.
Well said. Yeah, I've always said I'm a forever student because I'm going to be constantly learning, and I really want my entire community and everyone to learn that as well, that we are all students, and to think of themselves that way. It makes it even more exciting when you realize you don't know so much. You're just scraping the surface of it, and there's so much more to find out. It's a beautiful puzzle to put together in various ways, and we're only getting little pieces as we go. Cam is in the chat. Thank you so much for being here. Cam's going to pick up the good allies, so thank you for that. Greatly appreciate you being here, Cam. And Doug Thompson, good friend, my good friend Boyd Sorensen went across the board from Minnesota to join the RCAF. Very proud to have jumped the border to serve. Thank you, Doug. See, there's one of those 30,000 or so that did it.
There's a story in the book where after the United States comes into the war, the White House or the Pentagon or the American military asks Canada, hey, if people want to come back, if Americans want to come back, can they? And Canada said, oh, of course. Yeah. And in fact, they even send a train around to all the major air training fields to explain the situation to American airmen or cadets. And a few thousand go back to the United States, partially because the pay was better. But many thousand stay with the RCAF, like your friend there. And they stayed, I think, because of the camaraderie, and they stayed because these were the guys who they had just been training with. These were the guys, for those who were overseas, who they would survive with. And I suppose these are the guys who they would go down with if they were to be shot out of the air. And one newspaper interviews an American in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. He says, are you going back home now? He goes, no, I don't think so. We're in the same fight here. We're in the same war against the fascists. And I think that, in the hyper-nationalized world that we kind of live in, that's worth remembering, that maybe that border, as you said, John, was porous in all kinds of other ways as well.
How did, as we begin to wrap up here, I'd really like to think about the post-war years, because in my opinion, because you have these two powerful nations as far as factories and production and things like this, it almost seems like you have two world leaders now next door to each other as far as building and producing and things like that haven't been bombed, that haven't been invaded, who now can take the forefront. Is that a proper way to look at that?
I think so. Certainly for Canada, we know the United States emerging from the war as a superpower, especially with Europe in ruins and the Soviet Union having suffered so terribly, and Japan and China and everywhere else. But Canada too is also a very wealthy country, largely because we're connected to the United States and that wartime trade that we've been talking about. Before the war, Canada had been devastated by the Depression. Our industries had, just almost stopped. We were a pretty pathetic country. And so the war transforms us. We, for instance, we loaned Britain about $3 billion back when a billion meant something. And that had never happened in our history before. And so the war transforms us, become a more industrialized, wealthy nation. We bring back our veterans. So a bit like the American GI Bill, we have something called the Veterans Charter, which sends veterans to university, which was almost unheard of before the war. They have retraining opportunities. They can get loans to buy houses. That's the push that develops the prosperous Canada of the second half of the 20th century. We have more social security nets. We had state-run wartime Canada, and in the peace, people said, let's continue that. And so new social security nets. It goes on, including Canada joining NATO in 1949 as a original founding member. And we work with the Americans in the defense of North America as well, through NORAD from 1957 onwards. So you're exactly right. The Second World War is this hinge point for Canada, for the United States, and for the two countries together. And we ultimately become a much more North American nation because of the war. We still, many English Canadians still for another generation will have very strong feelings towards Britain. But Britain is no longer great after the Second World War. And we become much more connected through that North American trade and everything else, culture, and then there are different struggles for Canada to deal with how it will retain its Canadian sense of identity. But that, John, that may be another book.
I was going to say, this is 19. 20 seems like a nice round number.
Yeah.
For everyone tuning in, thank you for being here. Remember that there is a link below to the book, and this is my nice paperback reader's copy that I received, and the hardback is back there in the permanent collection for the good allies. This is a really fascinating read because I learned so much in here that I never knew or heard of because of things that you talked about in the Fight for History, and it all connects. And everyone who's watching should get both, actually, and start your Tim Cook collection with this. I really want to thank you, Tim, for your time and for your availability to be here to talk with my audience. And I'm sure there are going to be a few here who reach out to get one of your books, because if someone here hasn't read any of Tim's books, you need to start. You really do. I remember getting At the Sharp End way back in 2010, I think, is when I picked it up, and I've been reading your stuff since, Tim, and it's been great to read this one and add it to my permanent collection. And
thank you.
Really, really appreciate your time, my friend. And I'm waiting for number 20 now.
Yeah, thanks, John. I appreciate that. And hello to everyone, wherever you are. And thanks so much, John, for doing this and helping to get out the good word. Absolutely.
Everyone, please be safe out there. Take care of yourselves. All of my friends back in the U.S., be safe, be well. And as I said, please pick up a copy of the book. All of my Canadian friends, hope you're having a fantastic day, and be safe as well. Take care, everyone. Until next time, keep reading.